Okay. Well, it's 12:02, so I think we'll get started. My name is Julia Patton. I am an analyst with the Legislative Fiscal Division. I work primarily on K-12 education, but I also do some work on property taxes and I'm adding income tax to my repertoire as well. And then we also have Kurt Swimley.
I'm personally also a fiscal analyst. I do expenditure analysis for the Office of the Commissioner of the Higher Education and the Historical Society, and then also do revenue analysis for property taxes.
And so for today's training, we'll go back and forth a little bit between the two of us, going through the property tax tool and then also the school funding tool. So I'll start by sharing my screen. And we will start on the uh, the legislature's new website. So that's legmt.gov. Um, And from here, if we go under the fiscal division, there's a drop down. You can see we have some policy and fiscal libraries, and we also have a link to interactive tools. Um, so under policy and fiscal libraries, I think this is a link to our old website, something we may need to get fixed. But for the purpose of going through the tools today, we're gonna go here. And so we'll go first to the property tax library and the property tax tool. Um, so not only do we have our interactive tools, but we also have quite a bit of background information that's been compiled on the Montana property tax system, national property tax studies, some various pieces about local governments and schools, some more specific stuff about exemptions, abatements, and tax increment financing, and some property tax class information. So there's really quite a bit of information here if you are curious about learning more about property taxes. But for today's training, we're going to go through the interactive tool. Um, and so I believe there's a link here to a prior property tax training we've done, but there's also a link here to kind of a tutorial for how to walk through the tool. And we'll be going through a lot of that today when we're going through the tool. So in order to pop it out, you just hit this button here, the kind of box with an arrow in it, which says open in full screen mode. And then if you need to get out, you can press the escape button. But I think we're going to start with having Kurt go through the initial dashboard or two,
Mhm.
and then I'll go through a couple of the other dashboards later.
Sure. So this dashboard right here, you can see that this main one essentially looks at a lot of where taxes that are paid come from. Um, you can see the top left graph is probably the one and the easiest to start on. Or sorry, this is where property taxes paid go to. This is when property taxes are being paid, they end up being compiled and go out to different taxing jurisdictions and taxing units throughout the state. So some property taxes are collected and go towards local schools. Some property taxes go towards cities and towns. Some goes towards the county. A fair amount go towards the statewide. And then there are other taxing jurisdictions as well that can receive property taxes and can receive some of their part of their funding through property taxes. So in this top left graph up here, if you want to pop it out and get a closer look, you can go and hit the top right focus mode and you can zoom in on some of the details. But looking at this graph should give you some details on where property taxes are going to and how it's changed over the years. You can see on the bottom x-axis for the graph that each fiscal year is broken out up to fiscal year 2024, and property tax is are for each different jurisdiction are broken out. If you do pop it out, you can always click this back to the report button in the top left to head back to this main screen. Another thing that we can do, and I'll show here first, is you can filter two different pieces of information on this page that will change the graphs and the visuals throughout the page as well. So if, for example, I was very much interested in the state's portion of property tax payments, you can click the statewide portion, and it'll filter on this left part of the graph to the statewide portion. Another thing that happens when you do this is you can compare some of the percent growth of the statewide property tax collection throughout the years to different indexes on this right-hand graph right here. We have an index for county personal income and income and county population and inflation index as well. So you can compare the growth in property tax payments relative to the growth in those other indexes. If you want a bit of a comparison of like, okay, what does this mean for me in real dollar terms? Another thing you can do is we can filter to specific counties. If you want to look at, say, Cascade County, you'll notice that you can click on that, and that changes the how the graph looks, and that changes the dollar amounts in the graph. We're now filtering to only the property tax payments that were paid to the state from taxpayers within Cascade County. If I click on this statewide thing again, I can unfilter it, and you can see now that that changed the picture of the graph at the start as well. And that's probably going to have a very different look than if we click to Carbon County. You can see that there, as you filter throughout the state in different counties, you can see what's going on in different regions within there. You can also filter to specific municipalities within a county as well if you click on this button. So we could go to, say, the city of Hardin specifically within Bighorn County in this example, and filter in on what is going on there for taxpayers within that city. On the bottom left, you can also see a comparison chart of what the taxable value growth has been throughout the past 8 years, as well as and compare that to the actual taxes paid. So as you may remember, taxable value is what determines the makeup of properties that end up paying property taxes, and properties that have higher taxable values within a jurisdiction end up paying a higher share of that jurisdiction's property taxes for the funds they collect. So if you're interested in what's gone on in a certain area, you can look at this graph as well, and it ends up being filtered alongside everything else. And lastly, on this bottom right side, you can see a comparison. You can see the compound annual growth rate, which is essentially an average or typical growth rate for property taxes collected per year to see how over the past 8 years or so, what has been the typical property tax growth and for different jurisdictions. As you can see in this instance, for example, countywide education has had the smallest overall CAGR or average growth in taxes, whereas this other taxing jurisdictions category has had the highest average growth, but that also comprises a bit of a smaller overall piece of the pie when we compare it to like the state or local schools. So it just provides some additional information if you want to look at a broader picture and get some numbers that might filter out some of the outliers and get rid of some of the big bumps you might have seen within a year or so. Moving on to the next page, it'll look very similar, but this is instead of looking at which taxing units are collecting property taxes, this is a breakdown of the different classes of property that end up paying property taxes. So this is kind of which properties are paying taxes and where the taxes are coming from. As you can see in the statewide growth over here, we have this page broken out into some of the larger types of properties that end up paying classes. Residential is the one that sticks out on this graph as being the it has both the highest value of taxable value in Montana, and residential properties historically pay a large chunk and have been paying most of the property taxes even recently, as compared to some of the other classes of property. So you can see that we also have different classes include commercial properties, pipelines and electric, agriculture and forest properties, some business equipment, and then we have an other category that includes a lot of the different property classes. You can see it and read it down here if you're interested in the description what it is. A lot of these end up being specialized classes like airlines and railroads, and then different electric equipment and whatnot. So that's a breakdown throughout the state. So a lot of these classes have fairly small portions of property that we've just grouped into that one other class. You can also see, if you look at this top right graph over here, a breakdown of the percentage of paid by tax class. So if you don't want to look at the overall picture right here and just want to say, okay, what am I looking at proportionally to the other classes? On this right graph, you can see the percent of all property taxes paid by each class throughout the different years. And you might notice, hey, the spike up and the bump up in taxes paid by residential property in 2024 compared to some of the other classes. Just like with the last graph, you can filter and click on, say, residential and filter to a specific tax class if you want a closer look at that. And you can also look at a different county. And this might be very relevant because different counties have very different mixtures of tax classes. So if you look at Flathead County, for example, the majority of the taxes paid end up being residential property. But that might have a bit of a different look if you look at Fergus County, where a larger portion or a larger makeup of their taxable value is from this pipelines and electrical tool tax class. So they have more taxes that are coming from those types of properties compared to Flathead. It's probably worth, if you are interested in your jurisdiction or specific area, to look at that and see what is going on in that district, because there's a lot of different things going on throughout Montana. I might turn it back to Julia to look at some of the newly taxable property.
So the formatting of the next two dashboards is going to look very similar to the first two dashboards that Kurt showed you. We'll have one dashboard that breaks newly taxable property down by taxing unit. So again, that's the entity that's collecting the taxes. And a dashboard that shows new property or new and existing property by tax class. And so I'll kind of go through these together. And flip back and forth between the two of them. But on the bottom right hand, or sorry, bottom left hand side over here, we have total taxes paid. The gray amount is basically the amount collected the prior year. And so any of the colored amount is new tax growth or new taxes paid. But because it's kind of hard to see the amounts of new property or tax increases on existing property versus taxes from new property, we've broken essentially the difference out into the chart above. So this is just the change year over year that you're looking at, but it's a little bit scaled up, so it's easier to see the bars in the chart. And so we have one smaller portion here in blue for tax increases within TIFs. I won't get into TIFs too much. If you have questions, you are more than welcome to get a hold of our office and we can walk through those with you. And similarly, we have the compound annual growth rates up here, and those will change as we filter things on the right-hand side. So this top right graph is going to take essentially the tax increases on existing property. So it takes the green amount from this left-hand chart and breaks it out between taxing unit. And then the bottom chart here does the exact same thing, only it's taking the kind of purple here, the taxes from new property, and breaks them out by taxing unit. And so one thing you'll notice is that the kind of pattern on the bottom right-hand side here for taxes from new property is kind of consistent year to year. I mean, the amounts differ, but the proportions of each taxing unit are very similar. And that's because when new property comes onto the tax rolls, it's coming on and paying taxes in proportion to what's already there. If a new home is built in Gallatin County and they're spending, 40% of their property taxes are going to schools, then that is going to be true for that new property as well. However, if you look at tax increases on existing property, those are often from local decisions. Like in 2018, you'll notice there's a relatively large bump here in local schools. You can see that's almost 68 million just for a local schools taxing unit. That's statewide. But that was for a couple reasons. One, the school district block grants were eliminated in 2017. And so local property taxes rose to account for that difference in 2018. But then you also had several larger school districts across the state voting to build or repair some of their school facilities. So Bozeman built a new high school, East Helena built a high school, I believe Kalispell had a large high school construction project. Townsend did some major repairs on their, I believe, middle school, maybe their elementary school as well. And the timing of those just all happened to coincide with 2018 when those block grants were eliminated. And so that's a big bump you can see here in 2018. In 2024, obviously the statewide collections jumped up with the reappraisal cycle. And so that's where you can see the tax increases on existing property there. But that actually affected all different taxing units because, you know, even the cities and towns and the counties had some kind of fixed mill levies that were voted that also jumped up with that reappraisal. And so what I'm going to do here is filter to, I think, Gallatin County, just to show you an example of kind of what changed. This is maybe a higher growth county. You can kind of see in 2019, normally we'd expect to see somewhat of a tick-tock for reappraisal here. And because the vote to build the new high school in Bozeman actually took effect in 2019, it kind of erases the effect of the tick-tock from the reappraisal cycle in 2019. I'll filter to Judith Basin County. This is maybe a lower growth county. And you can see that here, this is actually a county where existing property pays less property tax now than it did 7 years ago. And this can occur when we have shifts in the tax burden. So the lower amount is in total. If we go to the next slide and we look at, again, Judith Basin, you can see that residential here in the light or in the teal is actually paying more than it did a few years ago. And that's because you have some shifts between classes here. Let's see. I have another example of Pend Oreille County. And this is a case where taxes paid by new property are high enough that it's actually buying down taxes on existing property in some of the non-reappraisal years. So you can see like fiscal year 2023. And so this is also kind of an example of existing property taxes adjusting to budgets and needs versus new property coming onto the tax rolls a little bit more proportionally. And that's because of the way that property taxes are attributed to cities and counties as opposed to schools. I mean, cities and counties have limits like in 1510-420, but those limits are not absolute. They don't include newly taxable property. They don't include voted mills. And so the school property tax formulas are a little bit more constrained. And so often when you see reductions on existing property, they are going to come from those very formulaic type budgets, which are commonly in local schools or countywide education. But if we look at an example like Dawson County, you can see that you do sometimes have reductions in other types of property. Here it's cities and towns. And so local governments, such as cities and towns, can also choose to offset their existing property taxes with taxes from new property. It's not required, but it does occur. And then the only other thing I'll point out here is that we had a reduction in the statewide amount in 2020. And the only way that can occur is if there is a total value reduction, because those mills, again, how they've been applied, it's been 95 across the board for the last, 25 years. If the mill number doesn't change, then the amount collected will only rise and fall with the value of the property, total taxable value of the property in the jurisdiction. So again, I kind of use these two dashboards in tandem to go back and forth and look at, if I'm looking at my example in Dawson County and I'm curious about which taxpayers it's affecting, you can see the breakdown of the different tax classes. It's kind of like I did with that example in Judith Basin, but I think that's pretty much all I have for newly taxable and existing property. And I think I'm going to turn it back over to Kurt to talk about the next couple of dashboards.
Sweet. So this next few are just different ways of looking at property taxes and some different comparisons you can make to try to figure out what is typical and what is atypical throughout the state. This dashboard 5 right here, we have a map of Montana, and this is a map of different effective tax rates throughout for different property tax levy districts in Montana. So a levy district is a boundary that contains properties that all are paying similar taxes and similar mill rates to different jurisdictions that are collecting taxes from them. So the effective tax rate we're measuring here is taxes paid as a percentage of assessed property value. You're probably aware that from different Montana, different areas have different typical houses. A lot of houses in Gallatin are worth a lot more than they might be in a Baker City, even if the house is similar, just because different regions are selling at different places in the real estate market. So this is an attempt to kind of get away from like looking at it in terms of just taxes paid or like and look at it taxes as a percent of their of the effective as home value essentially, or as a percentage of that value in the market or within that jurisdiction. So this map right here shows the effective tax rate. You can see this 0.6618% for residential property throughout the state. And if you are interested in looking within a certain county, I'm going to go to Beaverhead. You can click on this. It'll take a bit to filter, but it should show you Beaverhead County and show you the effective tax rate for residential properties within that. You can also look at effective tax rates for different types of property. You can see the higher effective tax rate on a commercial property as well, and see what it is for different levy districts within there. You might note that some of these went white when I clicked on the commercial property. This is because some levy districts really don't have certain properties of some type. So, whereas there might be some residential properties within this levy district right here, it looks like it's missing commercial properties, so we're showing that as blank. You can also click and see like the business equipment tax, and then one thing I would like to do is like zoom out of Beaverhead, but look through the state. But you might notice that that is also for business equipment, and then especially for pipelines and electric equipment, ends up having a lot higher effective tax rate throughout the state for the levy districts that have it. This is because in statute, there is a higher tax rate for pipelines and electric property. I believe it's 12% for most pipelines and electric property, as opposed to a 1.35% for residential property. So that effectively results in they're paying more or a higher proportion of their assessed value in taxes. And that shows up here on this effective tax rate screen. So this is an attempt to have us be able to compare apples to apples when we're talking about effective tax rates, and taxes is a portion of value throughout the state. This next page right here, I won't spend too much of our time. Julie can talk about it real quick.
So everything that we've seen so far has been specifically mill levies on property in Montana. There are other kind of property tax type revenue that are collected on your are part of the property tax bill that are collected via a fee or kind of an unconventional mill type. Sometimes there are mills I think that are based on like the
Frontage of your property
yeah,
on
the
the road.
road frontage of a property, or some things like that. And so those are what we call special districts. Um, so the ones that are collecting fees or unconventional mills, and those are shown here, and they're not included in any of our other dashboards because they are not a traditional property tax mill. But in order to get kind of a sense of scale and maybe the purposes of those districts, you can filter to say a specific county, like again, Beaverhead. A greater proportion of theirs are used for solid waste and landfill, some irrigation, road, streets, and sidewalks, and then some lighting. If you go to maybe a more urban county like Lewis and Clark, you can see there's just a different breakdown, some fire, ambulance, a large chunk of other, which can include all kinds of things. But really, I mean, there's quite a bit more we could probably do with this. The data is not quite as thorough as the kind of property tax mill data we have. And so this is just an attempt to kind of get at what amount is being used in each jurisdiction and what is it being used for. So I'll turn it back over to Kurt here to talk about some of our per capita dashboards.
So these next two dashboards, 7 and 8, are showing taxes per capita or taxes per person within dashboard 7 shows it broken out by the different counties across Montana, and dashboard 8 shows it broken out by each city within Montana. These are for fiscal year 2022, which is the most recent year that we have reliable data on county populations and city populations across the state. So we don't have the more recent years, but we will update this once we do get more recent years of those population counts. This is an attempt to look at it and say, like, okay, what is the per person? What are these each county or each city paying? This is one other way that we try to compare apples to apples, as it can be difficult to compare a large city like Billings to a smaller city like Choteau, Montana, for example. So this is trying to break it down, saying based on the people, how many people live here, what are the taxes being paid within there. You can also, once again, focus in on different taxes classes. Right now, when I don't filter it, one thing that you might be noting is that Carter and Webo County stand out a lot. This is because they have a lot of different pipeline electrical property. So it might be worth filtering to residential property if you're interested in residential comparisons, which shows a much different picture and is probably a lot more closer to what you expect. You can see that Madison County, since the vast majority of its value is residential property, and there's still not a lot of actual residents within Madison County, is the outlier right here. But then some of the other larger counties with larger cities are also ones that pay higher portions of per capita residential property taxes. You can, if you want to look at some of the different taxing units, like looking at the statewide portion, the county portion, and countywide education, you can look at some of these different ones right here. But this is another way to try to look at what's going on within your individual county. This next one shows the same picture, but is broken down by city and town. Once again, we see Colstrip coming up at the top with the highest taxes per capita. But once we filter it to residential, Nyhart jumps out, but the other ones are Missoula and Bozeman, which are probably a bit closer to what we expect for per capita property taxes within cities and towns. So there's some functionality there that you can take a look at if you're interested in comparing property taxes between different counties or cities. This next dashboard, dashboard 9, came out of a request for the Modernization of Risk Analysis Committee, and it is kind of a what if scenario look at what if some of the different property tax, some of the legislature's property tax controlled rates were changed. So on this page, there are 3 things that the legislature has control of that we are modeling within this page right here. And that is the residential tax rate, which is currently set at 1.35%. The number of mills collected for education equalization, which is currently 95. And then the district general fund GTB ratio parameter, which is essentially a ratio that controls how much state support goes out and ends up being distributed to local schools from the state. The higher the GTB ratio, the more support will go out from the state. And this in turn ends up buying down some of the local education mills that cities or counties would need to collect otherwise to fund their schools. So these are just some different parameters that we have broken out to try to model what would happen if you had in statute changed one of these parameters during fiscal year 2024. As you can see, when I bumped up that residential tax rate, you can see that this tax pie graph shifted up and more. So this is modeling more residential taxes being collected. Page 9, one thing to note, is only looking at the state's mills and the state tax collections. There is a separate page, page 10, which looks at tax collections by different cities and counties and models what might have been collected if these parameters were a bit different. So this page right here is only looking at state revenues. So if we set this back to 1.35, for example, you can see that this should be very close to what is present law collected and what was actually collected during fiscal year 2025. If you reduce the education mills to, let's say, 78, you'll notice that we expect that that is going to cause about close to 80 million less taxes to be collected by the state. So if you want to model some of these impacts of some of these different state parameters that the state sets, this might be an easy way to do it. Since property taxes also affect local cities and towns, it might be also worthwhile checking this page as well to see what the tax impact within for local collections would be. This table right here and this bar graph down here break it down into different tax classes to see what taxes are impacted by them. This is really where the state district general fund GTB ratio comes into play, where if you bump that up, then that ends up impacting local tax collections. I might let Julia explain that a little bit more.
Yeah, and one thing I'll say is that like the residential rate will change both slides 9 and 10. The equalization mills will just affect the state collections. The GTB ratio will just affect local collections. And so the GTB ratio now is actually 2.62 as of fiscal year 2025. So if we make that adjustment, give it a little bit of time to crunch the numbers, you can see the differences in the taxes paid by class. And again, on any of these, you can filter to a specific county. Say you want to look at Gallatin County again. Again, give it a little bit of time to crunch some numbers. It's doing a lot of math in the background, but you can see what changing the GTB ratio to 2.62 would do in Gallatin County and how it would affect the different tax classes. So say you want to take the GTB ratio up to 3. You can see what that might do to not only Gallatin County, but also the state as a whole for each of these different tax classes. I'm not going to go too much into how GTB works. I'll talk a little bit about that when we go through the school funding tool. So I can answer your questions there. But I kind of wanted to get through the property tax tool before we move on to school funding.
One last thing that I'll note for this tool as well is that this tool assumes for local collections that we are going to, the local entities, cities and counties and schools will collect the same amount of taxes as they ended up collecting in fiscal year 2024. So any change that you make here, especially with a tax rate change, ends up shifting property taxes rather than reducing them. So if I reduce the residential rate, for example, to 1.00, a lot of the impact that ends up being modeled here is a shift where the residential properties end up paying fewer taxes, and then other property taxes are taking up that burden, since we're assuming that those tax jurisdictions and tax entities still need to collect the same amount of revenue. So that's one thing to note when we're looking at these local tax collections as well. The final slide is a new addition, so I don't know that anybody has seen this, but it's essentially just a breakdown of comparing the fiscal year 2023 taxes by class to fiscal year 2024. So you can see that 1 year difference that changed. You can see the breakdown in the pie chart below, as well as a table that breaks out some rounded taxes paid estimates by each class. And once again, you can filter to taxing units, the county that you're interested in, the municipality. This might be helpful if you're interested in some of those smaller tax components for other classes, such as railroads and airlines that we had just grouped together in previous pages. So that's out there and available. And let me know if there are any questions. We'd be happy to take them. Otherwise, we can move on to the schools tool. All right, don't see any questions, so go for it.
So up here on the right-hand side, you can see the different libraries. This time, instead of property tax, we'll go to school funding. And similarly, we have a number of background materials, some previous trainings that we've done, the lunch and learn training we did on school funding earlier this month, etc. But really what we'll focus on today is the tool itself. So Montana has a funding formula that has 2 pieces. The first piece of the formula is essentially drawing limits on the, kind of metaphorical bucket for funding. There's a base budget limit and there's a maximum budget limit. And those are based on certain school funding components, certain percentages of those school funding components. And so in order to create the base budget, you can see 100% of the 5 fully state funded components are used. 140% of special education and 80% of the basic and per A and B entitlements. Those percentages change when you look at the maximum budget. The base budget is generally about 80% of the maximum budget. Here they're looking at 100% of the basic and per A and B entitlements rather than 80% in the base budget. Still 100% of the 5 fully state funded components, so that doesn't change between the two. But here it's between 175 and 200% of the special education component. And so if you're curious about the different components, you can read a short description of them over here on the left-hand side. Notice you can scroll up and down, so there is some text that you won't be able to see if you don't scroll. But for instance, the basic entitlement is basically a per district payment. Different amounts for elementary districts, middle school districts, high school districts, and then based on the size of the district as well, there is kind of a scaling factor. The per A and B entitlement is basically a kind of enrollment based entitlement. So A and B is a proxy for enrollment. It's not exactly equal to the number of kids sitting in seats. But again, it's an enrollment proxy. And so schools receive a per A and B payment based on the number of students attending in their district. And so here you can look back to prior fiscal years and look at the base and max budget. This is kind of an average statewide, unless you filter to an individual school district, like Alder Elementary. And you can see then the base and max budget. Keep an eye on this scale. Here you can see the base budget is just under 150,000. If we go back to the state total, it's again, between 1 and 1.2 billion. So just be aware, it may not look like it's shifting a whole lot, but it is. The second component of our school funding formula is actually filling up the bucket with money. So the 3 components that are used to build the base budget are shown down here in green, same colors as on the previous dashboard, but obviously they're funded at different amounts. So the districts get 100% of the 5 fully state funded components. They get the special education component from the state, and they get direct state aid, which is the per A and B and basic entitlements. However, even though 80 and 100% of those basic and per A and B entitlements were used to draw the lines on the bucket, the districts are only receiving 44.7% of that from the state. And so that leaves kind of a delta here, which we call the GTB area. So everything you see here in green is state aid that every single school district receives. It doesn't matter if they are, have a ton of students, have very few students, if they have a lot of taxable value wealth, if they don't have a lot of taxable value wealth, if they have non-levy revenue or not, they receive these 3 state funding components. However, in the GTB area, different districts receive different amounts of property tax revenue, non-levy revenue, and GTB aid. So GTB aid is really a payment that helps equalize differences in revenue generating capacities between school districts with different tax bases. And so not every district will receive GTB aid. The other thing I want to point out is that there is never a case where there are no property taxes in this area, but the district is receiving GTB, because GTB is a per mill subsidy. So there has to be some property tax in this area to match the GTB payments from the state. And so if we filter to some different school districts, let's see, I'll go to Ennis, which has, it's a district in Madison County, and it has the Yellowstone Club as part of its taxable value. And so you'll notice that because of the property value wealth, and the lower enrollment, it's only about 444 students for the K-12 district, pretty much the entire GTB area is filled up with local property taxes. However, if you look at a different example, say Browning, Browning Elementary District, you can see there's quite a bit more GTB aid with, again, some property tax revenue since it is a per mill subsidy. You can also notice that this district is not operating at max. They have a budget just above their base. Um, Most districts kind of on a statewide average, we're at 97% of max. But some districts operate at max. There are a few exceptions that allow them to go over max, usually when there's declining enrollment. But then some districts are operating at their base. And so in this case, Browning also has impact aid, which we don't see showing up in the district general fund. It's in a separate fund. But there are definitely some different moving pieces that kind of explain why different districts have different funding makeups. We can also look at Lambert, which is in Richland County. You can see here that there's not any local property tax or guaranteed tax base aid in the GTB area. It's all made up of non-levy revenue, which is generally from natural resources such as oil and gas. They also have some fund balance reappropriated, which is basically money from the prior year left over. And there are limits to how much they can kind of keep from the prior year and roll over. And then I'll show you one more example. We have Gardner, which of course is sitting right on the boundary with Wyoming, right by the park. And they have a large amount of tuition in their over base area. And that is because they're receiving students who reside outside the district, probably in the park or right across the state line. And in order for those students to be educated in the Gardner district, the district of their residence is actually paying tuition to the Gardner School District. And so that's what you're seeing here, that's showing up in the overbase area in purple. Again, statewide, it's not a huge amount, but for certain districts, it can be quite a bit of their funding makeup. And so if we go to the next page, you can see this same general fund over time. Again, on the second page, make sure you scroll if you want to read more about certain funding components, because there is some extra information that didn't quite fit. But this is showing the exact same thing, just on a scale over time. And you can also look at how enrollment has changed. So you could filter, say, to Amsterdam Elementary, and you can see how the enrollment has changed. It started at around 172 in 2015, was at a low point of 144 in 2020, and is back up to that about 172 amount. And you can see the funding has kind of followed that trend. The enrollment dipped, the funding dipped, the enrollment recovered, the funding followed that trend. The other interesting thing to point out here is that until 2017, there was a portion of non-levy revenue, or a much larger portion of non-levy revenue. Those are those school district block grants we were talking about in the property tax model. And when they were eliminated in 2017, local property taxes, as you can see here in this kind of golden color, backfilled that reduction. But as part of that legislation, the GTB ratio was dialed up over the next 4 years. So you can see that we went from about $160 million in GTB to about $236 million in 2021. So over those 4 years, that GTB ratio was dialed up to kind of help ease the effects of eliminating the block grants. So those three dashboards go kind of deep into the school district general fund. There are several other funds. We have 2 countywide funds. So when we talk about the countywide education taxing unit in the property tax model, we're really talking about countywide property taxes that are being collected for retirement and transportation. And so you can filter to either of those funds here, say the retirement fund for Beaverhead County. You can see what different components of funding are in that retirement fund. There is a state retirement GTB aid that shows up there. Again, because it is kind of a more need-based or allocated based on the property value wealth and the number of students in the district, certain counties won't receive it. So I think Carter is one of those. They have a lot of property tax wealth compared to the number of kids and some non-levy revenue. And so again, they don't receive retirement GTB. You can also look at the transportation fund. I will caution you, this is only the county portion. The transportation property taxes are a little bit unique in that there is a component at the county level and also at the school district level. And so in order to see the full picture, you really will need to look at the individual school district funds, which are shown on this slide. So there are two different types of funds, budgeted and non-budgeted. The budgeted funds receive property tax revenues, the non-budgeted funds don't. And so of the budgeted funds, we can look at any one of the, I think there are 10 funds. So say we want to look at the transportation component, you can see here that in the kind of burnt orange color at the bottom, that is the countywide revenue that we saw on the previous slide. There's also a local property tax revenue component, which is in the golden color here. And then there's a state transportation aid component as well that is kind of GTB, I think GTB like in some ways. You also have, let's see, the retirement fund. There is a retirement fund at the school district level. Basically, it's just money from the county sent to the individual school districts. And then they use those, or the individual school districts use the revenue coming from the county to pay into the retirement systems. And so that's why you see it's just saying countywide school retirement revenue, because it's really just kind of a pass through. We also have the debt service fund, which is primarily property tax revenue. There is a small component of state debt service assistance, which again is GTB like. We have the building reserve fund, which is similarly used for school facilities, which again has a GTB like mechanism for state major maintenance aid. But I'll look at briefly at the tuition fund before we move on to the next dashboard. This is a fund that in 2013 kind of had some expanded uses. There was a bill, I believe it was Senate Bill 191. I think that's correct, that passed in 2013 that allowed the tuition fund to be used for certain special education costs. And so because of that new allowed use, the revenue, which again is primarily local property taxes, grew. It's increased almost tenfold over the past decade. Again, it's, $31 million total in 2023. The debt service fund is 135, so it's not as large a component as some of these other funds, but it's definitely a large source of growth. If you're curious or have questions about what these different funds do, I encourage you to watch the property tax training that we did earlier this month, which went into depth into some of the funds and what their purposes are. And then really briefly, I'll go into our non-budgeted funds. So we have included 3 of them here. That is by no means all of them. They're just 3 of the kind of largest and most often asked about funds. First, we have the Impact Aid Fund. So if you recall, I mentioned Browning earlier. If you go to look at Browning Elementary, you can see that they do receive impact aid. And this is how much they're receiving in that fund. One thing I'll note is that not every school district is going to show up here. If you go down to look at, say, Missoula, you're not going to find it. And that's because it doesn't have an impact aid fund. It's not receiving impact aid. You can also go to the school food fund. This is a fund that is receiving primarily federal school nutrition grants. And so you can see the breakdown of this fund, again, by school district. And finally, we have the miscellaneous fund, which is mostly kind of title funding. So you've got the titles 1 through 10, I believe, from the federal government. And you can see that here in purple. You have some Medicaid funds, some other federal funds, some local district revenue. Again, it's the miscellaneous fund, so kind of miscellaneous uses. But here you can also see the COVID grants, the ESSER funding in 21, 22, and 23, a little bit in 2020. We also have the federal IDEA funds, which are used for education of individuals with disabilities. And then there's also a small amount of state funding. Some of these smaller state appropriations for very specific purposes, like the Montana Digital Academy, the Indian Language Immersion Program, etc. Again, not a huge amount in total, but it is included in these funds. And I'll point out the same thing on the budgeted fund. Say you go to the transportation fund, or no, not the transportation, sorry, the bus depreciation fund. This is a fund that's used to accumulate funds for the replacement of buses. And say you want to go look at Missoula again. You scroll down and you don't find Missoula, which would be here. The reason for that is Missoula contracts for its bus services. And so all the costs for buses for Missoula are going to be in the transportation fund for the Missoula Elementary and Missoula High School districts. So just be aware of that when you look through this dashboard, that not every district uses every fund. Finally, for our last dashboard, we have a map. It's as of 2023. Some boundaries can change. Sometimes there are mergers between school districts, but for the most part, this is pretty accurate. Again, be aware it can be a little bit slow to load, but if you want to go look at a county, say Beaverhead, you can select that county, and it will zoom into all the school districts in that county. We have two maps here because Montana has kind of a unique makeup of school districts. We have some school districts that are elementary and high school, and they're kind of split. So there's an elementary district that overlaps with a high school district, and sometimes the boundaries don't align. Sometimes multiple elementary districts feed into a high school district, or an elementary district can feed multiple different high school districts. But then you also have K-12 districts. So those are, isolated. They don't feed into elementary or high school districts. They're kind of on their own. And so if you look at, say, Absaroka Elementary, you can find it on the map here for the elementaries. If you want to look at Anaconda High School, you'll find it on this map over here. And then if you want to look at, say, a K-12, Baker K-12, it will show up on both maps. And again, it'll filter to the enrollment here on the right-hand side. The other thing that it'll do is it will filter the county. So if you want to know what county Baker is in, it'll filter to the county up here. Be aware that some of the districts overlap county boundaries, so there can be some kind of funky stuff with some of those districts, but for the most part, it's relatively accurate. But it just gives you an idea where these different school districts are located if you're trying to figure out, why they might have a lot of non-levy revenue. For instance, if you didn't know where Lambert was, you could go down here and you could filter to Lambert High School, and you could see, oh, it's up here on the border with North Dakota, and has a lot of natural resource wealth, specifically oil. So that is pretty much everything we have for today. I know it was a lot of data to go through, but we're happy to take any questions if you have any, and